There we go. Okay, thank you everybody for coming to this session. You are in the user experience for search and discovery session. We're going to kick things off. This might be a little bit of an unusual session since it's long form and you're just going to hear me talking, and then we're going to do a bunch of hands-on exercises as we go. Real quick check for the virtual people on Zoom. Can you hear me? Back. There we go. Better. Okay. All right. So we're going to dive right in. So I'm putting this up here. This is a QR code for anybody that has a laptop. There's also a little URL. You can grab the slides, and there's a Google Drive that'll have some documents in it. So you can either do this in that space, or I have printed materials. I have 50 printed materials, so I don't know how many people attended this session. That should get us close if you want to do it in person with pen and paper. And we'll actually, at the second part, all use pen and paper. So if anybody on the Zoom call is able to have some pen and paper available, that'd be great. All right, my name is Brad Andrick. I work for a company called Element 84. I'm an engineering manager and senior UI UX front-end engineer, which is a long title. My background is in geographic science and environmental science with a grad school in cartography and GIS. And I've been in the game about a little over 10 years, bouncing between the public and private sectors. And how I talk about myself, typically as a software engineer that's a generalizing specialist, but specifically I care about digital cartography. Feel free to find me at all of the places. Element 84 is the company that I work for. We're a women-owned small business that works with public, private, and nonprofit sectors to build and develop geospatial data processing pipelines and build software that helps answer big questions about our planet. The agenda. So I want to walk through what we're going to do first, and then we'll kind of dive into things from there. So we're in the intro right now. I'm just going to give a little bit of a primer and talk about how this will be run. And then we'll move into the first part, which will go over identifying and understanding user needs. So we'll go over some UX, which stands for User Experience Design Basics in the context of geospatial. We'll go over User Personas 101, and then we'll actually get into a user persona mapping exercise. And if there's time, a little discussion and sharing. And after that, we'll move into going through map UI patterns, as well as working on a wireframing exercise, applying what we learned. And then again, if there's time, we'll have a little bit of discussion and feedback, and then we'll close things out after that. Housekeeping a little bit. I put it up at the beginning. I'm going to put it up again. This is the Google Drive for anybody that has a laptop and wants to go there for it. Or I have pen and paper. So at the ends of each row, not each row, but a handful of rows, there's some documents. So there's a packet. So if anybody can help disperse those as far as they can go around, they kind of are in the center, so they can go backwards, they can go forwards. Again, if you have a laptop and you want to do it that way, that works as well. And don't care about this material reading it yet. We'll get to that in a little bit. But we wanted to get it spread around the room a little bit. And that the printed document will be for the first hands-on, and the paper will be for the second hands-on. All right, it looks like that got spread around pretty well. There's a few extras if anybody needs it, just raise your hand. Also, please write down your questions. There's lots of pens and paper floating around. We will have question pauses throughout. So we want to try to keep things moving, but we'll stop at different points for anybody that has questions. So to practice that, are there any questions right now? 3, 2, 1, no? We'll keep moving. All right, to start before part 1, I'm actually going to start at part 0. So I want to introduce a challenge of design in geospatial, and then also a workshop scenario that we'll use throughout each of these hands-on exercises. So to talk a little bit about the importance of user needs in geospatial applications, I Googled and went on Indeed and found a job description for a generic geospatial type of job. GIS coordinator is a really common title that you see a lot of places, and this is from a real Indeed listing. I want to quickly touch on a few things that are inside of this. So this person that they're looking for should understand GIS tech and trends. They should understand on-prem and cloud geospatial infrastructure. They want to know Microsoft SQL Server and ArcGIS integrations. They want them to be able to do Python scripting. They want them to know about mobile GIS applications for iOS and Android. Various different database experiences again in there. Web application development. Also, GIS in municipal environments, so they want some domain knowledge there. They want you to understand business processes and software design. Databases are in there again, all of networking communication, project management, you might as well get your PMP while you're at it, software development methodologies, all of IT trends, various software application integrations, and then on top of all of that, let's get a FAA remote pilot UAV license while we're at it, right? And then it shouldn't be surprising that we end up with applications that might not serve our users at the end of that, right? So I did the same thing, but just for a user experience designer. And you can see the difference. This is just listing out previous UI UX experience, experience with software like Figma or Sketch or XD that's used for design. Interaction design and responsive design skills, wireframing experience. This was pulled from a healthcare industry, so they want a little bit of that would be great. And some B2B customer experiences. So quite a different list of skills. And I would argue that this person would create something that might be a little bit better for our users at the end of the day. And here's an example of Earth data search, which I would argue is a pretty good application. All right, so the workshop scenario. I'm going to read this out loud probably a couple of times, and I'm going to reiterate it as we go throughout the workshop. But this is what we're going to think about and frame our hands-on exercises around. So I'm going to give you a scenario as if a client presented this to you. We're going to create a climate dataset discovery application. So our goal is to create an application that allows users to efficiently search for and discover geospatial data related to climate. That's a pretty generic ask. It's also oddly specific at the same time to tie in climate, but I wanted to give us a little bit of something that we can all get our heads around. And as part of this goal, we have 3 features that will be asked for us. The first one, it will need a faceted search, so allowing the users to easily refine search criteria based on attributes inside the dataset. An interactive map that allows the users to visualize data. And then it will also need to support dataset preview and metadata. So detailed metadata for each dataset, including source information, data collection resolution, data quality indicators, download size, probably add et cetera onto the end of that one. So again, I'll say it one more time. Our goal will be to create an application that allows users to efficiently search for and discover geospatial data related to climate. We'll see this again as we go throughout. Any questions right now? Great. We'll keep moving. Okay, so that brings us into part 1. So I'm going to start with some presentation materials, and we're going to talk about some user experience design basics and the geospatial components. And then we'll move into Personas 101, and then we'll actually get into our first hands-on exercise. So what we see here is a list of common tools that we have in our tool belt in the user experience world. You might be familiar with some of these, all of them or none of them, and that's okay. So we're going to talk about user personas, user journeys, user flows, wireframes, prototypes, and usability testing. We're going to specifically dial into user personas and wireframes for the purpose of this session. So the next slides that I'm going to show, there's a handful of them, and they are going to be very text heavy, and that's on purpose. That's usually sets you up for bad presentation, but I want this to be taken with you. Again, I put the slides up. You can access that Google Drive with all of these documents, these slides, so you can use this after this session is done. But I'm going to read a few of these out, and then I'll jump over a few other ones. But user personas, something that we'll get into here shortly. User personas are fictional characters created to represent the different user types that might use a site, brand, or product in a similar way. In the context of geospatial, that's something that we need to consider because user groups have varying needs in the geospatial world. They might know more about geospatial data, they might know less. And so balancing that and considering who our users are is really, really important in that context. Here's an example of a user persona if you haven't seen one before. This is one that is an Element 84 template, and you'll see this again later. And we actually have some of these prepared and provided, as well as a Figma template for anybody that does use design tools. You can import this and change it and use it from there. But this is generally what a user persona might look like. User journeys. So a user journey essentially drives the user through all the steps that they're going to accomplish when using a website or an application. So that's kind of the entire experience. So here's an example of one from a NASA publication, and it's really thinking about everything that that user is going to have to do, from who they are, where they are, opening up their laptop or desktop, all of those things to leaving the application. It's the entire process and charting that out. User flows, kind of confusing with the user journey, but user flows are really about a specific feature and a flow through that application. So it's a little bit smaller than a user journey, and it's probably something that we've seen before, which is just a process flow diagram. But you open up a feature, you click on this, you click on that, you end up what you need or what you don't need, and then you loop back through it. Wireframes, the other one that we're going to get into in this session. Wireframes essentially are designs of what the application might look like. So these can be low fidelity, basic layouts, or they can be high fidelity polished mocks that actually look like the real application. And in the geospatial context, sometimes we're constrained by the mapping libraries that we are able to use. And so it's really important to think about that first so that our designs align with something that could actually be built. And so that's something that we want to consider in the geospatial world. Here's some examples. So typically we start with hand sketches, which is what we'll be doing later on in this session. I still always start with hand sketches. And then you can kind of move into lower fidelity mocks where you see some gray boxes on a screen and that sort of thing. These are important because we can iterate pretty rapidly with wireframes before we end up actually cutting code and creating an application that is very much more expensive to change at that stage. Prototypes, essentially taking those high fidelity mocks that we saw and making them clickable. So those high fidelity mocks are relatively static. They're just kind of screenshots of a screen. And these prototypes, you can use different tools to create them, make them clickable. So it's that next level. It puts in, it takes more work to create, but you get more back from your users because they can click through it and give you more feedback. Here's an example of one. You can kind of see it scrolls around. It kind of looks like a real application, right? It is not a real application, not to be confused with a real application, but from this, before you spend all the time to actually build an application, you can see what works and what doesn't as a user clicks through, and you can see their behaviors. Lastly, I wanted to touch on usability testing. So this is really about talking to our users, right? So we don't need to talk to them in the beginning. We need to talk to them throughout. We need to talk to them after we've created something and see what's working and what isn't working. It's really about that user-centric design. Also, what is the difference between general user experience and geospatial user experience? Sometimes it can be as simple as it is just regular user experience things with maybe a little bit of map knowledge added in, so in that context of user personas. And then sometimes we need a much deeper understanding of the geospatial context of things. Again, that design process when we have to adhere to specific map libraries and our wireframes have to align with that. User persona 101, again, lots of text on the screen. I'm going to read through a couple of these and then you'll have this for reference, but this is generally what goes into a user persona. So take note because we're about to do this in a little bit. We have a name and a role, typically. Demographics, sometimes that's an optional thing. Sometimes you specifically want to leave out some of those things. Goals and tasks, so what they actually want to do is really important to write down, not just to make assumptions. Technology proficiency, so what are their skills in data analysis? How confident are they with technology in general? How about their map understanding? Needs and pain points, so specifically writing down challenges that that specific user might see is really important. Understanding their motivations and why they want to actually use the application. Sometimes the environmental and the context of what they're actually doing. So are they in a desktop? Are they sitting next to a supercomputer? Are they in the field with low to no reception? All of that needs to be considered at this stage. Their behaviors and preferences, or their habits or things that they typically use, similar applications that they might be used to. A quote is really useful as well, just to, in a short sentence, explain their attitude or preferences towards things. And then finally, and specifically optional, photo. I actually prefer to use avatars because photos can introduce bias, and so we want to be a little careful there sometimes, so avatars are a good alternative instead of leaving one off completely. I also wanted to show, again, that template. So this exists in the Google Drive, so feel free to import it into Figma. I also wanted to quickly share, we have two links inside the slide deck for a persona library. So this is going to link out to a library of user personas for open data. It's a really good resource to get some ideas from. Some of these are no longer maintained and they might link out to dead things, but that's okay. It's a really good resource, and specifically I want to call out to one of those just so you have another one in your frame of mind here. This is one that's specifically tied towards geospatial that's included in that set of links there. This one might be a little bit more wordy than I would choose to create one as, but just wanted to have that in there for you. Any questions at this point? Nope. Okay, great. Got one. All right, I'll repeat.
I'm going to be not a question, but more of a comment guy.
Sure.
So,
Thank you, Matt.
thanks. So I think a critical missing piece of the user personas, and I've seen this over and over again in these discussions, is that the proficiency piece is one-dimensional, right? I think there is how well can you do technical things, and I think that is a separate axis from how well do you know the data and the discipline that you're working with, right? A lot of scientists cannot write a line of code to save their lives, but they can know all the differences between the different data sets. They know which variables are most appropriate for a given science topic. And that is always missing from these discussions, or almost always, and it always leads to problematic designs that don't take that into account, right? We focus on technical proficiency, but we don't focus on disciplinary knowledge and how that guides the user journey. So can you fix it?
That's great. Well, I will point out in our Element 84 template, there's something called process knowledge in our indications of those. So we're trying, at least, it's in there. But very great comment. Thank you for that. Any other questions or comments before we go? 3, 2, 1. All right. So that gets us into our first hands-on. I'm going to talk a little bit more before I let us loose on that. So I want to share some pre-generated resources that I have, and then we'll show a persona, get into the exercise, and then we have some template examples. So these are the instructions that we're supposed to follow. Again, this is supposed to be interactive for people in the room. You can do it virtually or on your desktop. We have the materials that we handed out. But what we're going to do is review the example user interviews. So in this packet, you'll find 10 questions that were asked. Typically, what you would do is actually talk to your users. We don't have the time to be able to do that. So I've created some mock interviews with 8 individuals answering 10 questions. And your goal is to read through all of those and then try to distill those answers into 2 common user personas. Again, a user persona is supposed to identify a general user of this application. So we're not getting into too many specifics here. But use pen and paper. Again, you can do this digitally as well. Let's see. And then at the end of that packet, you'll see 2 persona templates. So you can fill those out. Again, I want to reiterate our goal from our scenario is to create an application that allows users to efficiently search for and discover geospatial data related to climate. And lastly, feel free to use a form. So there's a Google form that I'll show here in a second that you can actually use to submit photos. If you want to take a picture of your persona that you come up with at the end and share it with the group, we have a Google Drive set up for that and a Google form that links to that. Really quickly, I'll jump over to that. So inside of the Google Drive, which is linked in the session docs, there's a quick links, which has that Google form if you need it there. And let me hide my screen here. And those materials are also inside of the Hands-on One user personas folder. You'll see our mock interviews. These are both as Google Docs and PDFs. You can copy those into your own Google Doc, again, or use the paper in person here. All right, this QR code that's on the screen right now, if you scan that with your phone, it'll open up the Google form. Once you're done, if you do want to submit them into that, there's an optional name and upload a photo if you care to share them with the group. So we're going to set about 20 minutes on the clock for this. And again, feel free to go around the room. If you want to chat with anybody, that's totally fine. I'll be here if you have any questions about this. Again, read first, then think through everything and try to distill out 2 user personas, again, in the context of a climate search and discovery application. Any questions? All right, clock starts now.
Hi, Brad.
Hey, Jason. Yeah.
You can hear me? Okay, good. I thought while people are working on this, I had a question. I know you and I have worked together on mocking up UIs that are related to AI and ML. And I was thinking throughout this, if you could think about how that changes what you're thinking about as a designer for creating these applications. Specifically for personas, I was trying to think, like, would it actually apply here or is it later? I was thinking one thing that would be good to capture in a persona is what would be natural language questions that this user would ask that they'd want answers to. I think that's just useful in general, even if you're not using AI. But then specifically, if you're thinking about natural language interfaces, it would help there as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. And my initial comment to that is that's very new, right? That's still in the past couple of years something that we've kind of started to think about more and more, especially with everybody using ChatGPT and everything else. But that's a really good thing to be thinking about, especially in the future going forward. All right. Time to come back together. Hopefully, everybody was able to end up with at least one persona or at least an understanding of what that process takes. Continuing on, really quickly, I wanted to open it up. If anybody has any comments for the room or in general, something you enjoyed about that, something you found challenging or absolutely hated about that. Does anybody have any comments for the group? Yeah, one second.
Yeah, so this is super interesting. And one thing that I found challenging was I ended up thinking about the scope of what my organization can provide to the users and how important it might be to frame the questions so that the users don't come away with expectations that are outside of the scope of what I can provide.
Thank you for that. That's very important. So many times setting those expectations matters significantly for what the end user actually comes away with. Any other comments, questions? Yeah, we've got one in the back. Thank you, Matt, for being the runner.
I work for a maintenance team that covers 150 square miles of mostly communication and remote sensors. But the engineering team that I work with almost universally doesn't know anything about weather and climate and things like that. So for me, it was a major challenge trying to find relevant elements to map onto the personas for this task.
Gotcha. Thank you for that. Anybody else? 3, 2, 1. Okay. We'll keep moving on then. So one thing I wanted to share here, I ran through this exact same exercise myself and created what I see, in my professional opinion, as what might be 3 personas that I would derive from those interviews. I'm showing them here. I also want to point to these exist as PDFs in the Google Drive that's been shared with everybody as well. So feel free to look at them afterwards, dive into them more, and kind of compare and contrast if you see that as useful. All right, moving on brings us into session 2, where we're going to be talking about wireframing geospatial applications. We're going to start with going over some presentational materials on map UI patterns, and then we'll get to our hands-on number 2 of actually wireframing something. And all of that will keep the thread around our search and discovery for climate data application and those personas that we just tried to create. So map UI patterns, I want to introduce that here for anybody that hasn't heard of it before. It's a book as well as a website by Michael Geig. He currently works for Esri, I believe. I have no official affiliation with Esri, this book, and I point it out because the website has the same content of the book, open source for free, if you care to look through it. It's really, really valuable, the information that he presents in here, and that's some of the things that I'm going to present here to you today. So what are UI patterns? They describe solutions to observed and recurring problems, things that we've seen before and see over and over again, so they're important to identify. Specifically, what he talks about here, he compares it to atomic design. So atomic design in the user experience world, we try to break things down into atoms at the very lowest level. So that's a button, that's a text input. And then we combine those together to create molecules in like a card or a grid. And then those all get combined into maybe a sign-in or an organism. And that rolls up into templates and then eventually up into an actual page. So that's the premise of atomic design. And so we can think about these map UI patterns as mapping back and forth to these atomic design patterns as well. So at the bottom, we've got our map and the interactions with our data and our layers. And then on top of that, we see about a workflow. So that's the actual interaction that you're taking with that map through the application. And then you've got your layout, how you're actually putting things on the screen. And then above that, kind of some general UX. The chapters, I wanted to show the titles of these. We don't have time to go into all of them, but this is to encourage you to go look at those resources on the slide that I shared, because there's a lot of good information in here. Chapter 1 goes over some general design. Chapter 2, selecting the right layout. Chapter 3, interacting with the map. Chapter 4, dealing with complex data. Chapter 5, designing for mobile devices. Chapter 6, my personal favorite, building single-purpose apps. And Chapter 7, common mistakes and how to avoid them. We are going to go a little bit deeper into Chapter 2, selecting the right layout, and Chapter 7, common mistakes and how to avoid them. So as far as the chapter on selecting the right layout, we've got a handful of options in these common patterns that are identified. Full map. So you've probably seen this a lot before. Google Maps kind of pioneered this, where we have one giant map on the screen and then things are kind of sitting on top of it. The things sitting on top of it sometimes can be a problem, so just need to be a little careful with that, but this is one really common, just big map on the screen. Similar to that, you have a partial map. So this is, I would argue, still a map-centric application, but we see this one a lot in search and discovery, particularly where we have something on the left or right side that contains our search criteria, maybe our results show up there, and then the map is side by side with that. We also have a reference map. So this is starting to make the map a little secondary at this point. So I wouldn't call this map-centric per se, where you've got maybe a search area, and then you've got data, charts, graphs, and the map is just a component of those secondary resources. An embedded map. So this starts to get into kind of story map territory, if you're familiar with that. You see them in journalism as well. And it's really, again, secondary or even beyond that, where it's just supporting the larger context of what you're trying to communicate to your users. No map, which is really interesting, right, in the context of geospatial data, but is really important. And I would actually add one myself in here that's no map yet. So we think about search. If you think about Google search, everybody's familiar with that. They still just have one search input bar, right? And then you end up going to search results. There's some examples of map UIs that start in that same fashion, and I'm really excited about those. And then finally, focusing on the subject is also something that we can consider in selecting the right layout. And this is really where we have maybe a big map, but then all of our details aren't shown in that same user interface. We see those as secondary. So once you click on something, then we see maybe more context show up in a modal or a pop-up or something along those lines. The other chapter I wanted to walk through were the common mistakes and how to avoid them. So we've got the kitchen sink problem, which is a problem that I point out more often than I'd like. And really what this is talking about is trying to fit everything into one application. And I think that this really came about in the early 2000s when we were kind of transitioning into the web world, and we had a lot of geospatial folks that used really heavy tools on their desktop, and then the web world came along and they said, great, let's do this there. Right? But then they weren't maybe thinking about the users as much. And if the people that are using it, it happened a lot in local government, if I just want to find parcel information or what day my trash pickup is or things like that, I probably don't need advanced geospatial tools, right? And so this is something that still happens, and we're getting better about it, but it's definitely a problem to be aware of. Desert fog. So not having context on the map, not having a home button, right? Getting lost on the map and not being able to reorient yourself, that can be a problem. And then the data ink ratio. So here, if I wanted to show data for the United States on a Web Mercator projection, pretty common, we're going to see a lot of space that doesn't have any data showing up on it, right? All of Canada on our projection. So maybe choosing a different projection or some other way to visualize our data makes a lot more sense than having a lot of dead space on our UI. Wireframing. That's the next topic that I want to touch on before we get into our hands-on exercise. So we kind of have 3 steps to this. So sketching, hand sketching, what we'll do today. And then that kind of moves into lo-fi, where we see some boxes on the screen. We don't really have a full polish yet. We've got just maybe not quite the colors or no colors at all. And then finally, we get some more polish at that higher fidelity level. So sketching, this is where I always start. You today will start the same way that I start most of my projects, with a pen, pencil, pen, paper, and go from there. And the reason that I love to do this is that you can iterate super, super quickly, and it's completely open to whatever you're able to draw. You're not constrained by tools that might not quite do what you need it to do. Since you can iterate so quickly, you can throw away your piece of paper and draw something new on another one. Problem is, those are pretty hard to share and communicate with, right? And so then we kind of want to reach for these low fidelity mocks. So here's something that we might start thinking about. What text is on the screen? If there's a button on the screen, the placement of things on the screen. We're not adding colors or a final polish yet, because those colors and those final polish take a lot of time. And so if we want to move quickly and communicate what we want, this is a great place to start. And then finally, we would generally transition from those low or mid-fi mocks into a high-fi mock, where we have polished colors, maybe some brands, some logos, design. All of those things have been considered at this stage. They take longer, though, so that's why we kind of generally jump into let's add colors and get everything correct in this final mock-up. Any questions about this section so far? Yes, we have one.
It sounds like it takes a long time to do all this stuff. And I mean, it makes sense for, when you really want to get everything right. When does it make sense to skip those steps and go, faster through these?
That's a great question. And anybody who's ever been a stakeholder that needs to watch the budget has asked that question, and probably asked someone like me that question about, do we have to do all of this? And the short answer is, well, you don't have to do anything. I generally like to point back to a project management triangle that has time, quality, and budget, and pick two of those things, right? And so you're always going to make a trade-off there. You can't have everything, right? So that's generally where I start the conversation. And there is a balance. And particularly when you're working with someone that's trained in these kind of design and front-end and user experience things, you can skip some of these things, right? So typically, I've worked with you on some design things before, and we kind of jump into drawing boxes on a screen in a design tool. And that's collaborative, and I can move quickly in that design software. Or I've pre-gamed a little bit and hand-sketched things knowing that we have a meeting coming up and thought about it beforehand. So that's not a great answer, but I don't know that there particularly is one, and it's kind of the wonderful answer of it depends. And as much as we can, I think the value of considering the user needs as much as possible that we're able to fit in really impacts the final results and what our users are actually able to do. We've got one other question in the back.
I would also add that the cost is potentially a lot more if you don't do those things and then find yourself having to redesign everything.
Yes.
As well.
I had a quick question about, I guess, like reusability in some of the mock-up approaches you take. So especially with this goal that you've set for this like hypothetical project, right? I keep finding my brain going back to sort of like, hey, this is seems a lot like sort of like a data repository or a system that we can search. And there are a lot of really great examples of those UI UX patterns. So I'm kind of curious how you bring that into play to make things, I guess, go a little bit faster, where you're not necessarily having to like mock up the same, card or search layout from scratch over and over again. And then how does that time and cost savings from like an agency perspective get passed on to the consumer so that they can get to market faster with a product, and also kind of reduce cost on that front?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say there's not a lot of resources readily available. So applying these map UI patterns. So if someone wants to talk to me about funding an open source project to design some quick mocks that we can create based on these design patterns, I'd love to talk about that more. But typically in my work anyway, I've done this so many times, and it is from scratch a lot of those times. And there are common things that I do over and over again. One, I can reach back to that work that I've built before and grab one of those as a starter place, right? You can also start, because we're usually in a design tool, we can bring in an image and be like, okay, this is what the client says that they want. They've given me some concepts, and I can draw some boxes on a screen quickly to get to that point. As far as going beyond that, it can be really hard when someone wants to do something that's slightly different, right? So these patterns work great a lot of the time, but not all of the time. And that's something that you also see in like low-code tools and web app builders and those sorts of things. They work great for what they're made to do. And then when that person says they want that extra customizable thing, you either have to be okay saying no, right, if you've made that choice, or you choose to be more flexibility, which probably has longer costs down the road. Hopefully that answers your question. Did we have one more real quick?
I was just curious of your opinion. People, the general public, have been using map-based applications for a long time now. So in the past, where you would be confronted with a map and people would like, what am I doing with this? I think that era's past. And so does that give us any kind of economy now in terms of designing things to where we don't have to overly overthink for people when they're faced with a map interface? I would think it would become simpler, but dealt with a lot of clients. I'm just curious if that is in fact true.
Yes, so my experience has been that people generally do recognize these patterns these days, particularly the Google Maps kind of pattern, right? And it's one of the reasons that I think these map patterns are able to exist, that we've seen kind of that understanding grow and this book be able to be, book and website be able to be compiled. That said, it's a little bit of a question, I was thinking about this earlier, on, well, do we want to create something new? Maybe not, right? We want to consider it, so there's a bullet in the persona work about their experience with things, right? And so part of that we should consider is if we give them something that we think is better, but they're familiar with other tools that they use every day, right? Is it actually better, whatever I'm proposing, or not? And I don't think it's a yes or a no, right? It's a balance of all the things, but that's something definitely to consider on that point. All right, I think we'll keep moving, and we can have more questions later as well. Thank you. All right, so that was the presentational part ahead of our next hands-on exercise. So our next exercise will utilize paper and pens. So no printed materials, but there's a bunch of paper floating around the room. It's just printer paper. I've got a handful more up here if anybody needs it. And also there should be plenty of pens. If not, please share. And online for our virtual attendees, again, if you can have paper and pencil, that's probably the route to go at your desk. So first, I want to introduce some inspiration screenshots. So we talked a little bit just now in our question session about what things that people might be familiar with, and that's really important. And I typically will go there when I'm working with a client and say, okay, what do you want this to look like, right? And that's a big question, but comparing it to other things kind of gives me a great starting place to actually take that and make it more specific to their users and their needs. And so I have a handful of these that I'll show. I want to point out that all of these exist in that Google Drive in a document as well in the hands-on 2 material. So these are in the slides like this, but they're also in their own little document. So here's one, and this is one that we've built at Element 84 called the Earth Search Console. And this is, we built from scratch. So we thought about everything, and this is specific for search and discovery kind of period. It's not really meant, at least that's the general take right now, but it's not really meant to do much beyond that. So it's meant for search and discovery. So we wanted simplicity. You can kind of see we had the partial map pattern in here and some simple filters, a search, and then a big map to visualize the results. Here's one that's NOAA View. And I'm going to show some of these applications people in the room might have worked on at different points. But here's definitely a little bit different of an approach than that partial map. So here we see a primary map, almost a full screen map. I would argue maybe we see a little bit of the problem of stuff sitting on top of the map, which may be good or bad depending on what we want to do with it. The Climate Explorer is another good one. So this has a map, but it also has lots of charts and other things that are in here. So the map is in the forefront, but it also can be secondary depending on some different toggles that you might change. Data access from NCEI is another great one. So this is a really good, where the map is actually secondary. So this starts at a search page, and then even at the top, at the second page, we still see a what, where, and when, simply put. And then below that, we see a list view of data before we even third tab over get to a map view. So that's a really interesting take on search and discovery. And then lastly, NOAA One Stop. So here's kind of back to that partial map. We see the sides. This is pretty familiar for a search interface, and a pretty large map, and then some secondary results down below that. Again, feel free to access those resources if you have a laptop. The links are included in that document in the hands-on 2 materials. So with that, we're going to move into the actual hands-on. And what we're trying to do here is review our goal first, which it's been a second. So our goal is to create an application that allows users to efficiently search for and discover geospatial data related to climate. We want to consider the personas that we used earlier as well, right? So those 2 users that we worked on identifying, we can think about that here and what they need when we're actually going to get into the wireframing and what we're going to build stages. So use paper and a pen to ideate and sketch through what a climate search application might look like. And then lastly, we have another Google form set up. So feel free to take a photo with that Google form if you want to upload it for the group to review as well. All right, the upload is at this QR code. Once you're finished, if you care to upload it, I'm going to set, let's see, I'm going to set about 20 minutes on the clock again, and then we'll have a little bit of discussion after that before we close. Any questions before we get started? 3, 2, 1. All right, timer starts now. All right, we have about 1 more minute left before we circle back. So if you want to go ahead and wrap things up and submit any things through the form if you'd like to share with the group. Again, 1 more minute. All right. I think we're going to come back together here. We've got 5 minutes left to close things out. All right. Thank you, everybody. So before I get to the final closing, I did want to also mention a process that we do at Element 84 that is really, really useful. And had we had more time, I would have us do this here with each other. But I want to still walk through the process briefly. So a design critique. This is how we do it at Element 84. We all critique. There's some rules that we follow. We critique continuously, starting early. So that iteration, that feedback loop, right? We can critique internally before we gather user feedback. So other designers sometimes have good ideas, sometimes have terrible ideas, but it's good to hear that before we go back to that end user. How to give valuable critique. So the best feedback is that which the designer asked for. So in a critique, it's sometimes really easy to look at the whole application that someone's showing you to critique and start calling out all of the things, right? But they really were asking you about this one specific change to a button on a form somewhere, and that's what they wanted to critique. So you want to kind of guide towards what they're actually asking for. Feedback should be aimed to identify questions or problems rather than solutions. So you can kind of point things out, but not really dictate or prescribe solutions necessarily. Have you considered, are you thinking about, I noticed, those sorts of things. And then receiving a critique, which is sometimes really hard to do, right? We made this thing, we made it well, we think, but it's really important to hear what other people think about it. So listen and take note. Don't defend immediately, which is a lot of people's natural response. And then follow through after the implementation of that. So do some of the things if it makes sense to do them, and make changes and iterate accordingly. All right, with that, as we're closing out here, summary of the workshop in general. This is the agenda to show one more time. So we had an introduction, then we went through identifying and understanding our users with some persona work, and we did a hands-on user persona mapping exercise. We did some wireframing, some map UI patterns, and those things included in there. And what you did, you gained understanding of why the problem exists. You summarized user stories into usable personas. You've seen a reference point for creating some professional persona graphics. You identified resources used when applying common geospatial UI elements. Used industry standard techniques to explore a design problem. And then you also sketched wireframes based on user research and feature requirements. Again, slides, all of these resources in the Google Drive. If you need to grab that, feel free. And then a parting Q&A. Again, my name is Brad Andrick. I wanted to call out some of my E84 collaborators. Mark Reese, our federal unit director, who couldn't attend ESIP this year, but is happy to chat with anybody about this work. Catherine Oldershaw, our climate unit director and design lead at E84. Also a really great person to talk to, especially in the context of user experience and design work. And then Trevor Lang, who works on the NASA Earth Data Search application, which so many of us use and love and have benefited from. Just a shout out to him for all the great work that's happened there. Thank you. Any final questions? Feel free to contact me afterwards. If not, I think we're right at about time, and enjoy lunch. Thank you very much.